Most people are told their blood work is normal, but normal is not optimal. I'm Tanya Malik Chawla, and this is Biology by Design. Your biology is not something that happens to you, it is something you design. So let's get started. If you've been diagnosed with H. pylori, there's a very good chance you've been told the wrong story. The story usually goes something like this. You have an infection, take these antibiotics, take these antacids, come back if symptoms persist. Now, before I go any further, let me be very clear. H. pylori is in fact a pathogen, one that contributes to ulcers, damages the stomach lining, and is definitely associated with serious gastrointestinal diseases. But when it comes to eradicating the pathogen and healing, we are simply not looking at the complete story. Because after working with hundreds of people dealing with chronic digestive dysfunction, I've noticed something super interesting. Yes, the bacteria is often present, but the more important question is, why was it able to thrive in the first place? Because I don't believe H. pylori is simply an infection problem. I think it's more often a terrain problem. And understanding that difference changes everything. Let's start with something most people don't realize. H. pylori is incredibly common, especially in India. In some places, more than half the population may have been exposed to H. pylori at some point in their lives. Think about that for a second. If more than half the population has been exposed to the bacteria, why doesn't everyone have symptoms? Why doesn't everyone have chronic reflux? And why doesn't everyone have ulcers? That's usually the first clue that something else is happening. Because if the bacteria alone was the explanation, everybody carrying it should be sick. Clearly, that's not the case. So the question becomes, what determines whether H. pylori simply exists or it actually becomes a problem? The biggest lie in digestive health. Okay, this is where I usually upset a lot of healthcare practitioners. But one of the biggest myths in digestive health is the idea that every person experiencing acidity has too much stomach acid. When you experience reflux, burping, acidity, bloating, the assumption usually is, I have excessive acid. And because we assume it is excessive acid, the solution simply becomes reduce acid, suppress acid, block acid, which means we end up popping antacids and PPIs. And for a short period of time, many people actually do feel better. The symptoms start to improve, but then something super interesting happens. Months later, years later, the person is still dependent on these medications. They're still bloated, they're still refluxing, and behind the scene, their ferritin is falling, their B12 is falling, they're becoming chronically malnourished even though they're eating almost fine, because their digestion has slowly started worsening. And they're often left wondering, why am I not getting better? Because symptoms are not the same thing as root causes. And this is where Biology by Design looks at the problem very, very differently. Why stomach acid matters? Most people think stomach acid exists just to cause acidity. Really, by now we should all know better, isn't it? Its primary role is digestion and protection. It is literally the first barrier to the external pathogens entering our body via food. It is responsible for breaking down food, activating digestive enzymes, mineral absorption, nutrient absorption. Stomach acid is one of our body's first line of defense. Now think about what happens when stomach acid becomes chronically impaired. Digestion becomes weaker. Protein digestion completely breaks, and this creates a rather vicious cycle. Since most can't digest protein anymore, they start to reduce the intake, and now the body is left without the basic raw material to heal. Also, mineral absorption becomes weaker. The digestive environment completely changes, and suddenly the terrain becomes very, very different. One of the most important lessons I've learned in functional medicine is this. Pathogens are opportunists. They thrive in a compromised environment. Yes, I'm going to say this again. Pathogens survive in a compromised environment, just like weeds thrive in a neglected soil. So the question isn't simply, is the weed there? The question is, what allowed the weed to thrive in that soil in the first place? And that's exactly how I think about H. pylori. Not just, is the bacteria there? Why was it able to thrive? What changed in the digestive environment? What changed in the terrain? Let's understand what H. pylori actually costs you. This is where things actually become interesting, because most people think H. pylori only causes digestive symptoms. But clinically, I often see a much bigger picture. What I see is low ferritin levels, high homocysteine levels, chronic fatigue, persisting brain fog, poor recovery, reduced resilience, and poor protein tolerance. And often, the person has no idea that the digestion sits at the center of all of this. Because digestion is not just about your stomach. Digestion determines what resources your body actually has access to. And if your body cannot access nutrients, eventually everything downstream suffers. Your energy, your metabolism, even your longevity. And here's where I think most people get trapped. Most traditional healthcare practitioners focus entirely on killing the bacteria. And don't get me wrong, reducing pathogen burden matters. But if all we do is focus on killing the bacteria while completely ignoring digestion, inflammation, nutrient status, protein intake, and your lifestyle factors, we're often addressing the consequences without addressing the environment that allowed it to happen in the first place. Again, I'm going to repeat this, the bacteria matters. But the terrain often matters much more. Whenever I see somebody with H. pylori, I ask these 4 questions. First, why was the pathogen able to thrive? What digestive dysfunction exists underneath it? What nutrient deficiencies has it created? And how do we stop this from happening again? Because those questions take us from temporary symptom management to long-term healing. And honestly, this isn't just an H. pylori lesson. It's a lesson just about our biology. We live in a culture that is obsessed with fighting symptoms. Suppress the cholesterol, fight the glucose, fight the pathogen, fight the weight, fight the inflammation. But biology doesn't always work that way. The better question to ask is what biological signals created the problem in the first place. Because when the signals change, the biological output changes. And that's the entire philosophy behind biology by design. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this episode, it's this. H. pylori is not simply a bacteria problem. It's often a signal that something inside the digestive terrain has become compromised, and it has been compromised for a while. And until we understand why that happened, we're often treating symptoms rather than solving the actual problem. The goal here isn't to kill the bacteria. The goal is to rebuild a digestive system that no longer allows that bacteria to thrive. And that changes everything. If this resonated with you, join the Biology by Design community where I share more insights, free assessment tools, and practice-based protocols. Thank you. I'll see you in the next deep dive.